Okay, so some of the questions we wanted to tackle today, I mean, such a big subject, isn't it? Such an important subject. Um, could you explain to us, Jill, what we mean by advocacy and perhaps the difference between advocacy and self-advocacy?
Um, Absolutely. I mean, this is probably something that on its own we could fill the session with today.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I mean, when I started working as an advocate in 2007, I got a job as an advocate within a community advocacy service that was a service for people with learning disabilities. At the time, it was run by MenCap and funded by a local authority, and they'd come to a realization, along with kind of really quite a lot of society around the time, that um, that as we now know, and as is kind of quite well accepted now, there was a group of autistic a group within the autistic population that wasn't fitting into learning disability services, and also wasn't having their needs met by mental health services. And so the service that I went to work for was getting increasing numbers of referrals for people that at the time didn't fit their eligibility criteria because they didn't have a learning disability. And so the way that they went about tackling that was that they got funding to set up and fund a specific post, so like a service within service for autistic people, which included autistic people with learning disabilities, but also included the whole spectrum. So that was the kind of the unique thing about it, really. And that meant that my job was as an autism specific advocate. And you know what it's like when, I mean, it's one of the number one topics for small talk, isn't it? People like to ask you what your job is. And when you say advocate, people don't quite know what you mean. I mean, it was kind of confused as well by the fact that most people assume advocacy is something legal.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
my background is in law. My first degree was in law, and my PhD is also in law. And so people assumed that I think that I meant something. I was doing something to do with the court service and litigation. So it is something that is not very well understood, and that is fairly difficult to explain in its entirety. And I think the reason for that is actually because of one of advocacy's strengths, which is that it's a really flexible concept, and it incorporates a lot of different types of practice and different approaches. I think in a nutshell, probably the way that I describe advocacy, I mean, I'm quite a literal kind of person, and I like words and kind of word origins and things. And within advocacy, you've got the voc part, which is obviously to do with voice, and the ad
Yeah.
part, which is kind of kind of like additional, or
Yeah.
alongside.
Yeah.
um and I think that kind of points to what I would say is advocacy in a nutshell, which is that it's concerned with voice, and it's concerned with fundamentally with ensuring that people's voices are heard.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
can mean any number of things in practice. It can mean ensuring that somebody's views are taken into account, and their perspectives heard on decisions that are being made for them, on their behalf,
Mhm.
or decisions that they themselves are making, if they're a person who's got the capacity to do that. And it means that that so that individuals are actually able to voice their own perspectives, their own concerns, their own priorities. But it also has a kind of a broader social meaning as well, in the sense that it's concerned with ensuring that the voices of communities are heard,
Mhm.
and groups of people, particularly those that are minorities or that are traditionally socially marginalized or not
Yeah.
heard, or whose concerns and priorities are not taken into account in society in general. So, that might be when local authorities or services are planning service development. It might be ensuring that the priorities of different communities are taken into account with that planning. So consulting people who have got lived experience or the kinds of expertise around the needs of those groups, and making sure that they're taken into account. And also just making sure that different groups and different perspectives and different ways of being are kind of represented in society.
I love that. Different ways of being. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
that's just it, isn't it?
I think I'd like to sort of clarify something when we say that it's to do with voice, which is tends to be the go-to when it comes to advocacy. If you look at advocacy, the names of advocacy organisations, local and national around the country, you'll find that most of them have got voice somewhere in their title. So
Mm-hmm.
I used to work for was called Your Voice, and most of them are something to do with voice or speaking up or something like that. And I guess especially for those of us that are more literally minded, there's a couple of things that we need to just be mindful of. I mean, a lot of what I talk about and what I'm interested in is kind of to do with the social, so to do with the way that society works, because I think that if we're interested in social change for groups such as autistic people, which is our concern, those of us that are here today, we need to understand the group, so the autistic community, but we also need to understand society.
Yeah.
And a lot of what we need to understand with regard to society is kind of we have parallels with other communities. So the LGBTQ community, for example, and that's not saying that being autistic is the same as being lesbian. Some of us are both. But it means that our experiences of social oppression and of social marginalization have parallels. But there
Mm-hmm.
are some things about our experience that are nuanced and that are different than other communities, and that are inflected by what it means to be autistic. And I
Yeah.
think one of the things that we have in terms of being autistic when it comes to thinking about voice is, of course, that for a sizable proportion of our community, voice means something quite different than the vocal kind of projection of sound.
Mm-hmm.
Um, our community has a much more diverse kind of range of ways of communicating and kind of expressing ourselves. Obviously, a lot of our community are non-speaking,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and so we need to make sure that we're bearing that in mind. I think when we think about what advocacy needs to mean for us, my kind of like my main research interest is in mental capacity law, and I'm quite passionate about how people who don't communicate in traditional sort of verbal ways and things are supported to make decisions or to participate in decisions that are being made on their
So
behalf.
important. Yeah.
And I think that's something that we always need to keep at the forefront of our minds, including like in spaces like this, communities like this, when most of us who are autistic within this group
Mm-hmm.
will probably be speaking, people who speak most of the time. As a community, we need to be kind of watching out for everybody.
Yeah.
And the other thing is as well, just to clarify, when we talk about voice, and and in fact, when we were talking earlier, I was kind of prompted to think, because I found myself saying to you that what I think we're concerned about with advocacy is partially to do with presence in
Yeah.
society and
Yeah.
autistic presence. And I've been thinking about that and reflecting on it. And I think one of the reasons why I found myself going for that idea of presence is because so often when we talk about voice and having a voice as an autistic community, we end up getting kind of tying ourselves up in knots and chasing our tails around the fact that actually there is no real such thing as an autistic voice. It's not one thing. We don't speak with unity in terms of our voice and our needs, and actually I found over time that idea of voice as a single kind of concept that kind of suggests that we're all singing from the same hymn sheet, to use to speak figuratively, is something that actually is quite alienating for some autistic people who see themselves as individuals first and foremost, and don't like the idea of being spoken for or having a voice used on their behalf.
I have experience of that with a close autistic friend. That's something that they experienced.
And I think it can kind of end up in a kind of like a turf war, for who gets to be the authentic autistic voice, if you like, on behalf of the community. And it got me thinking that actually the idea of presence is something that has the potential to be much more pluralistic. A presence can be a sort of a blanket rather than one particular kind of space. So that's just my thought of the day, I guess, and I've just thought I'd share it. But
I think it's important because nobody assumes that neurotypicals, if there is such thing, or nobody assumes that either neurotypicals or non-autistic or whatever terminology you want to use, nobody assumes that we're all the same.
No, and exactly, and actually that applies to kind of any social group. Like earlier we were talking about sex as an example, as in not all men are the same and nobody would expect them to be, not all women. And I think but there again, people don't go through the process traditionally. I mean, some people do for various reasons, but most of us don't go through the process of being diagnosed as female or as being diagnosed as I don't know, Christian, for example, or lesbian. I think there might be something in the concept of diagnosis that kind of makes us think that we're all homogenous, we're all expected to be kind of one thing. And of course, like the rest of society ties into that as well, the ways that lots of us are told that we don't look autistic or we don't act autistic or whatever. It's
how exactly are you supposed to look?
Well, it's something I've never got to the bottom of, if I'm honest. Like, I still don't really know. I just know that apparently I'm not it.
Oh dear. Yeah, well, if anybody gets that memo, please share with us. But no, it's a bit of a puzzle.
I mean, I could take a guess, but I'm not going to, because
we're not going to go there. And actually, it says a lot more. It says a lot more about the person saying it, doesn't it, than anybody else?
It kind of points to kind of a deficit in social imagination, I think. Expecting autism to be one thing. That was sarcasm, by the way.